Well, thanks, Jenny, for having me back on the show. It's good to be with you. Look, when I think about my impression of the session, I try to always look at these things through the lens of conservative policy, right? How much did we get done to advance our policy priorities? And when you think about it from that standpoint, this was an extremely successful legislative session. I've been in the legislature, this was my second session, so for 3 years now. But I've been observing the legislative session, the legislature in Arkansas very closely going back to 2013. And I think this is the best legislative session from a conservative policy standpoint that I've observed or been a part of. And that's because there were a number of significant wins, policy wins, in major areas like education, with us passing the Universal Education Freedom Accounts as part of the LEARNS Act. Also, the big crime overhaul bill that included the parole reform and that will lead to the construction of 3,000 new state prison beds, which are badly needed. But there were a host of policy wins in other areas as well. Everything from taxes to welfare reform, reducing government red tape in the area of occupational licensure, and the whole host of mini bills aimed at pushing back against the radical left's cultural assault and a bunch of the nonsense that we see coming out of the Biden administration in Washington, D.C. Personally, I feel like it was a successful session for me as well. Probably the highlight of that for me personally was passing the special election reform bill that I've worked on for many, many years, even dating back to before when I was elected. And I think that's going to have a big impact for the taxpayers of Arkansas as we really cut down on the number of these sneaky tax increase elections that we see happen locally. I think in terms of the biggest policy win or the biggest piece of legislation passed, obviously the easy answer is to point to the LEARNS Act and the massive education overhaul reform that was passed. That was huge for a number of reasons. It was big, obviously, because of the investments and reform, or the investments that we're making into the teaching profession and into our public schools, but also really transformational from the perspective of passing universal parental choice in Arkansas, giving parents more of a say over where and how their children are educated. I think that this legislation is going to be a game changer going forward in education in the state of Arkansas. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I've been observing the legislative process in Arkansas really closely going back to 2013, and we have come up short time and time again in this area, trying to give parents more options for where and how their children are educated. And even in the times that we've experienced success, right, where we passed the Succeed Scholarship in 2015 or expanded it in 2019 and 21, or with the philanthropic tax credit scholarship that we passed in 2021, those were programs that really were only available to a small number of students in our state. And so we really broke through this time in terms of advancing the ball down the court. And look, a ton of credit goes to Governor Sanders on this. This is one of those things that would not be possible, or would be, at the minimum, be extremely difficult without strong executive leadership. And she really stepped up in pushing this initiative and giving people who were maybe on the fence the confidence to lean in and support it. Because as you saw, there were many people who have frankly been opposed to these sorts of policies in years past that embraced it this time. So that was the biggest policy win from my vantage point. Something that I wish would have happened but didn't, I will say, I think that we really need to consider coming back into a special session sometime later this year or early next year to do more trimming of our income tax rates. When we did the tax cuts during the session, I was of the opinion that we should have done more. that we should have provided more tax relief. And I think the fact that we're now seeing the state budget run another year of $1 billion surplus only reinforces that idea, right? I think it lends more evidence to my argument. And look, I don't think this is rocket science. When the state government is taking in year after year after year $1 billion more than we have budgeted for, that means that we're taking too much money out of the pockets of hardworking Arkansans. And so I would have liked to see us do more tax relief, but the good news is we still have opportunities to do that. Like I said, I'd like to see us consider a special session for that in the near future. But I do think it's fair to point out that we did a fair amount of tax relief. We did trim the personal and corporate income tax rates by 0.2% each. I think that was a total of about $130 million in tax relief. We also increased the homestead property tax credit by $50 per tax credit. So that's another $30 million or $35 million of tax relief. And then we began the process of phasing out the state's throwback rule, which is a harmful business tax that will ultimately save somewhere in the range of $65 million. Yeah, the last thing that I would say is that while I think we had a really strong session overall, a lot of policy victories, a lot of things went right. Yeah, I think the last 2 weeks of the session were total mayhem. And I think that's because of all the rule suspensions that we saw. For folks who don't know, it's fairly common for the legislature when they get down to the last couple of weeks to suspend many of the rules. And that's done really in the name of efficiency and trying to get done on time. I'm really less concerned with getting done quickly than doing the work that we're there to do correctly and in the best way possible. I'm not a fan of any of these rule suspensions. I've voted against them pretty much every time that they've been offered, both this session and last session. But there's just not enough people that feel that way. Let me talk about a couple of the rule suspensions and why this is important. One of the things that they do away with at the end of session is minimum notice of committee meetings. Well, that's important because the committee process is really the only step in the process where the public can participate, where they can show up and explain why they support a bill or why they're opposed to a bill. Once a bill gets to the floor of the House, the debate is just between House members. Folks can sit up in the gallery and watch. They can watch on the live stream, but they can't really participate in the debate at that point. The committee process is the only part where the public can participate. And so I think getting rid of that minimum notice for committee meetings at the end of session, even in the name of efficiency, is really bad for the process. Another thing that we do is get rid of the delay between the 1-day delay between when a bill comes out of committee and when it's heard on the floor. And that becomes problematic because you end up getting these bill agendas where you're voting on 80, 90, 100 bills in a single day. And it just becomes impossible, frankly, to read them all and to vet them all and to do your due diligence. And, rushing these things through really, I think, tends to result in worse policy in a lot of instances. And the last thing I'll mention, I think we waived the rule at the end of session for requiring a fiscal impact statement on legislation. Well, that's obviously a bad idea because when you cast a vote, you may not necessarily have a true picture of what the cost of that bill is going to be. So you may inadvertently end up growing government toward the end of session there as these bills just sort of run through the process quickly and you don't have a full accounting of what they actually cost. So, I think looking to the future, I would like to see us come back into session 2 years from now, continue to pass policy wins, good conservative legislation, but avoid all of this suspension of the rules at the end of session that I don't think lends itself to good policy.